Good morning. It's time to get started with our class this morning. If you would be opening your Bibles to Acts chapter 25. Acts chapter 25. And we're going to begin at the first of the chapter this morning. Jared, it's good to see you back. Good to have you home. Would you lead us in prayer to start our class?
Our God, Father, we come before you this morning. Thank you so much for all that you do for us. We know that all good things come from you, Lord. We're so thankful that we can gather together with family and friends to study your word, Lord. We know that there's a lot going on in the world, Lord. At this time, we ask that we were able to put those things aside and focus on while we're here. Make a stronger, closer relationship with you and those who are trying to do the same thing. We thank you so much for those who are here this morning. We ask a special prayer for Brother Josh and the many other teachers, Lord, who are doing their best to teach us the truth, and we ask that you please bless them and continue to bless them with a long, fruitful life. Please be with Brother Tom and David as they direct this congregation. We know that they oversee a lot, they have a lot on their minds, plus all the other things that we all have going on in our own lives as well, so please bless them too. Please be with us all here this morning. Please be with those who are able to be here and help them to be back at the next appointed time and help them to get back to their much long health. Be with us as we go throughout the rest of this hour. In your Son's precious name that we pray.
Amen. Well, Acts chapter 24 ended with Paul still in Roman custody. But it ended with a statement that this governor that was holding him, that was refusing to really make a judgment on the matter, was going to be replaced. Felix, when you go back and you study Roman history, you find that Felix's reign was one that was one controversy after another. He was not above resorting to murder, to bribery. You may remember we noted last week that one of the reasons why he continued to bring Paul before him was not that he wanted to learn more about the gospel, but because he was hoping that he would receive a bribe, that Paul would bribe him in order to get him to make a judgment call. But we find that during the reign of Felix, crime in the region of Judea reached a historic level. It seemed that nearly every nationality of people that lived in that region at the time fell into some type of violent altercation at some point. Felix reigned and there's differing lengths of time based upon which calendar system that you look at. Some say that Felix only reigned for 6 years. Some say he reigned 8 years. But we find that during that time, it was one constant battle after another. But one of the things with Felix was a Roman 100%. He did not care who he had to kill, who he had to harm, who he had to malign, so long as the will of the Romans was upheld. We find one of the things that he resorted to shortly after his coming to power. The high priest at the time was a man by the name of Jonathan. Jonathan spoke out publicly against some of the policies of the Romans. And so Felix went and he hired some Jews to go into the temple, wait on Jonathan, and murder him there in the temple. But also we find that during this time there came to be a very heated battle between the Jews in Judea and the Syrians. Well, Felix saw this as an opportunity for him to basically get ahead. And under the pretext of claiming that he was trying to restore the peace among these groups, he sent his soldiers out to essentially massacre as many Jews and as many Syrians as he could find. Rather than try to be diplomatic and try to work through the issues, he felt that by resorting to violence, if I kill enough people, it's going to force them into peace. But he took things even a step further. He then told those soldiers that after you go out and after you kill these soldiers, you go back to their homes and you can plunder all of their possessions. Anything that you find that you want, you take those things. Anything that you find that might benefit Roman culture, you bring and you turn it in to the government. The only thing that saved Felix from being prosecuted for these crimes was he had a brother who was a very close friend of Caesar Nero. He had a brother by the name of Pallas, who was a chief advisor to Caesar. He spoke well for his brother, and he was able to save his brother's life. Because as we've talked many times with these Roman governors, if they were appointed to a region and they were not able to keep the peace and promote Roman culture in those regions, then most of the time they would pay for it with their life. Felix, we find, was recalled to Rome. He lost his position, he lost his authority, he was forced to live out the rest of his life just as a common man. But he was never held accountable for these crimes that he had committed. Well, Felix was replaced by a man by the name of Porcius Festus. And history has remembered this man simply by the name Festus. Now, the Roman historian Josephus, he described Festus as a wise, just, and agreeable man. Now, when we read the things in the next 2 chapters that Luke records about this man, I see quite a contradiction between the way this man handled this situation with Paul and a man who would be described as wise, just, and agreeable. Because what we're going to find is that in Acts 24, 27, and then also when we get over into chapter 25, we're going to find that Festus, in order to try to maintain peace with the Jews, he was willing to go through with a plot that the Jews had put into place where it would lead to Paul's death. Not only that, he was willing to deliberately, publicly exploit Paul a number of times, but mainly before some visiting dignitaries, as we're going to read when he brought them before Agrippa and Bernice. And so whenever we look at this situation, we find that neither Felix nor Festus saw any crime that Paul had committed. They saw no reason other than to restore peace, to keep Paul in custody. But what we find with Festus more so than with Felix, Festus was willing to use Paul basically as a pawn of peace. Whatever he thought it was going to take to keep the peace with the Jews, he was willing to submit Paul to those things. And the only thing that broke this vicious cycle was Paul appealing to a higher power. Roman citizens had the right to appeal a case all the way to the highest authority in the land. With us, it would be like appealing to the Supreme Court. Under that Roman system, it was to appeal directly to Caesar. Well, recognizing that Festus was not going to make a decision, that he was going to continue to use Paul as this pawn of peace, Paul finally, he appeals to Caesar. And something that I find quite interesting, one commentator wrote that Paul's appeal to Caesar ultimately led to the downfall and the condemnation of Festus. And the reason for this, and we won't go real in depth into this, after Paul left Judea on his way to Rome, Festus no longer had anything that he could use rather than violent force, which his predecessor used and it didn't work out in his favor. He didn't have anything that he could use to keep the peace with the Jews. And so we find that Festus only reigned for 2 years. And during that 2-year period of time, historians have recorded that the majority of his time was devoted to the case of the Apostle Paul, dealing with this matter that he continually refused to make a judgment call on. Well, looking at Acts 24 and verse 27, we see that Felix, in leaving office, and this is something that we see with many politicians today. We see this with presidents, we see this with governors. Oftentimes, before they leave office, they will pardon a number of individuals. They'll hear certain cases, they'll consider different matters, and then they will make final judgment calls because they know they're leaving office and, it's going to be out of their hair from that point on. Felix, he could, prior to his being removed from office, he could have said, all along, I've not seen anything wrong with this man. I'm going to turn him loose. But most people agree that in a last-ditch effort to try to maintain some semblance of agreeability with the Jews, he agreed to keep Paul in custody and essentially passed the buck on to his successor. So Felix leaves office. Festus comes into power. So let's begin chapter 25. Now when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. So Festus has only been in that region. More than likely, he would have gone to Rome. He would have received his commission there. He's been now in this region, serving as the governor for only 3 days. After 3 days, he goes from Caesarea, which had become, so to speak, the central hub of government in that region. He goes down to Jerusalem. And while he is there, notice verse 2, the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul. And they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. So now they're looking at this situation. They're probably thinking, okay, we've got a new guy in the office. He is going to want to get things started, get things off on a good foot. He's wanting to impress Caesar. So let's go to him and see if he will extend us a favor. And so notice the chief priests, the chief men of the Jews, they all go to Festus. And they said, hey, this is what this man has done. We tried to get your predecessor to go through with this plan. He wouldn't do it. And I can imagine that there was probably a little bit of pushing there saying, well, if you'll do this, then it will greatly please us. We'll support you, what have you. And so they tried to get Festus to agree under the auspices of bringing Paul to Jerusalem to stand trial, to go along with this plot to claim the life of Paul. They're saying, we'll lay in wait, you bring him to Jerusalem, and we're going to jump out, we're going to ambush him, we're going to kill him. That's what we want to do. But showing a little bit of integrity, a little bit of wisdom in regard to handling these affairs. Notice in verse 4, Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself was going there shortly. Meaning he was not going to send for Paul to be brought to Jerusalem. This was not where this trial was going to take place. You know, all of the courts had been moved to Caesarea. The only court that was continuing to be held in Jerusalem at this time was the Sanhedrin Council. And the courts that they held handling Jewish matters. And so he said, no, he said the proper thing is to keep Paul in Caesarea. He said, I'm going back there in a few days. And what he means by that is, I'm going back there and then we'll settle this matter the proper way. Well, continuing, it says, therefore, verse 5, he said, let those who have authority among you, talking to the Jewish leaders, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there is any fault in him. So essentially he said, let's give this man a fair trial. Those of you that are your authority figures, y'all come back with me, and we'll handle this through the proper channels. Well, in verse 6, and when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. And when he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. So at this point, look at what is already presented. The Jews come before Festus. They make a lot of outlandish claims. They lay a lot of charges against Paul. But what was the one thing that they were lacking? Evidence. It was all hearsay. They were expecting Festus to take their word for it. But then Paul turns around, and in defending himself, he says, I've not done any of the things that they've claimed that I've done. They can't provide any evidence to support it. And so really what it was coming down to, it was a case of who are you going to believe? Which case is more believable? What these individuals who can't even agree upon what I've done wrong, they stand before you, can't give you any evidence, or me standing before you claiming that I've not said or done any of these things. So really it's going to come down to a case of hearsay. Who are you going to believe? Well, at this point, Festus knows that he's kind of in a tight spot. And I think probably at this point he's starting to realize why Felix never would rule on this matter. Because he knows regardless of how he rules, it's not going to turn out well in his favor. If he rules against Paul, he's ruling against an innocent man. And if that news comes out that he has abused his power and abused his authority, he'll answer with his life. But if he rules against the Jews and turns Paul free, it's going to cause an uproar among the Jews. Well, the main role of the Roman governor was what? To keep the peace. And so he's looking at this situation and he says, I really don't know what to do. I don't see anything wrong with this man. But he knows that no matter what he does, it's not going to turn out well for him. So continuing. He says, I've not done anything against the law of the Jews. I haven't offended the temple. I haven't spoke out against Caesar. I've not offended anyone in anything. But then we see a little bit of the character of Festus. He's displayed a few traits that would lead us to believe that he was upright, wanting to do the right thing. But then notice what verse 9 tells us. But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor. Notice it wasn't that Paul had done anything wrong. Notice it wasn't that he was worthy of any type of punishment. He wanted to get on the good side of the Jews. He knew that Felix had stirred things up and had been recalled to Rome because of it. And he's thinking, you know what, I'm going to nip this in the bud right now. If this is going to restore peace, he's willing to lay aside Paul's rights as a Roman citizen and go along with what the Jews want to do. And so, wanting to do the Jews a favor, he answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these matters? So he's trying to find a way to justify this. Now, we could look at this and say, well, it's a change of venue. It's going back to where these things supposedly took place. No, that wasn't his intention. What he's thinking is that if he orders that this trial is to take place in Jerusalem, and they're traveling to Jerusalem, and lo and behold, something happens to Paul along the way, that removes him from the equation. I didn't authorize him to be killed. I just authorized a change of venue. So he's trying to find some type of a way that he can cover himself. That he can keep himself from getting into any kind of trouble, but in the same way, he's trying to make peace with the Jews, trying to give them what they want. And so Paul, he responded. He said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews, I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I am an offender, or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. So he recognizes what Festus is trying to do. He recognizes that there's some underhanded backdoor politics taking place here. And so Paul tells him very plainly, he says, why should I go to Jerusalem? This is not a matter to be tried before the courts that are in Jerusalem. I'm a Roman citizen. I am where I'm supposed to be. Caesarea is where the Roman courts are being held. I'm standing here, notice he says, before the judgment seat of Caesar. Caesar was the one that had given authority to Festus to try these cases in this region. He said, I'm where I'm supposed to be. So why should I agree to go to Jerusalem? There was no reason. He said, I've not done anything wrong that would warrant this. But notice that he says to Festus, he says, and you know that. You know I've not done anything wrong. There's some speculation as to how he knew this. But I think the one that makes the most logical sense is in Roman times, if there was someone who was found blatantly guilty of a crime, they carried out punishment very swiftly. Paul has now been in custody for a long time. He has now stood before 2 different governors. He even stood before the Sanhedrin, and the Pharisees said, I don't see anything wrong with him. So he's saying, why should I continue to go through all of this? It's obvious you know that I've not done anything wrong, but you're not going to judge the matter. He said, so as a Roman citizen, he said, I'm going to do the only thing that's logical in this situation. He said, I'm going to appeal to Caesar. Well, under Roman law, as soon as he made this appeal, everything had to stop. No more interrogation. No more hearings. Everything had to stop. Now, one of the things that we need to recognize is that when an appeal was made to Caesar, a lot of times we hear people say that when appeal was made to Caesar, it was automatic. If it went to Caesar, that person automatically got an audience with Caesar. That was not the case. In this situation, when this appeal was made to Caesar, Festus had to send word of the appeal to Caesar. But in that documentation, Festus had to make a claim as to whether he felt that this hearing with Caesar should take place, or whether it should remain in his jurisdiction and let him make that call. Well, what do you think Festus was going to do? He was going to get Caesar to approve that appeal. He didn't want to make the decision. He knew his hands were tied no matter what. But if he sends this man to Caesar, if he tries to get him off of these charges, then he's going to have to, in this letter that he writes to Caesar, document the charges against Paul and why he believes he's innocent. Or why he believes that he does not deserve to go before Caesar. That was not going to please the Jews. Remember, the Jews wanted him turned over to them. But Paul had rights as a Roman citizen. The Jews were not able to punish him in the ways that they wanted. And so what we're seeing with this, Paul essentially had no other choice. He knew that Festus was not going to rule in his favor. Now, there's nothing in the text that says that he knew of anything about this plot that the Jews had against him. But he knew that Festus was not going to rule in his favor. And so he knew that his only option was to appeal to Caesar. Well, let's continue. Verse 12, Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, You have appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you shall go. This mention of the council in this verse is not talking about the Jewish council. It's not talking about the Sanhedrin. Most people agree that this is talking about his advisors. Those who would advise him in the decisions that he would make as this ruling individual. And so he confers with his advisors, and they decide that the best thing that they can do is let him go to Caesar. Not to keep him there, but to let him go and let Caesar handle Paul. Well, verse 13, it says, And after some days. Now we understand that after an appeal was approved, it would take a while for them to coordinate all the logistics. It would take a while for them to, using modern terminology, to get him on the docket to be there to stand before Caesar. And so he remained in Caesarea for a while. We're not told exactly how long. But while he was still there in Caesarea, verse 13 says, And after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice was the sister of Agrippa. It says they came to Caesarea to greet this new governor. They came to meet Festus. And when they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him. To them I answered, It is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charges against him. Therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions about him, about their own religion, and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I was uncertain of such things, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. Notice what he did right there. He's trying to cover himself. He's glossing things over. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. This term Augustus, something that we need to recognize. Augustus was considered the first Caesar. After Rome had reached the height of its power and the Caesars came into power, Augustus was the first of this line of emperors. He was the one that was in power when Jesus was born. Remember, he was the one that gave the decree that a census was to be taken, that everyone was to be taxed. And that's why all of the Jews had to go back to their city of origin. Hence, Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem. But we find that due to this, what they call the Augustinian line of emperors, still being those who were in power, oftentimes the Romans would refer to that main position as Augustus. Now, when we look at some other translations, we find that most translations, other than those like the King James, New King James, some of the very old English translations, they actually translate this term emperor, which is appropriate and which clears this matter up a little bit. Augustus was not still alive at this point. There had been several Caesars in power from the time of Augustus now to the point of Nero. And so what Festus is saying, he says, this man has appealed to the emperor. We've got to send him to Rome. Well, notice verse 22. Agrippa said to Festus, I would also like to hear from this man. I'd like to hear from him myself. Now, something to understand, Agrippa had no authority in this matter. This did not take place in the region that he was reigning over. He did not have the authority to try this case. Paul had already appealed to Caesar. He was simply waiting extradition to Rome. But yet, Agrippa, he says, I'd like to hear more about this. Now, whether he was really intrigued by the matter or he just wanted to find some way to impress this new governor, we really don't know the reasoning that he wanted to hear from Paul. But yet we find he was willing to listen to the case. Verse 23 says, So the next day when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at Festus' command, Paul was brought in. So these individuals, they were coming in, they were given, great fanfare from the citizens of Caesarea. These were visiting dignitaries who were coming. And so they come in. A lot of the prominent citizens of that city go into that auditorium as well. And once they're there and once they're seated, Festus calls for Paul to be brought before these visiting dignitaries. Well, Paul was brought in verse 24, and Festus said, King Agrippa, and all the men who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus or to the emperor, I decided to send him. I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. Therefore, I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not specify the charges against him. And so the way he's getting around this unlawful hearing, he says, I've tried the matter. I don't see that this man has done anything wrong. All of the Jews claim that he's done something wrong. They've brought these charges at Jerusalem. They've brought him here at Caesarea. He's appealed to Caesar. I'm going to send him to Caesar, but I really don't want to send him to Caesar without telling Caesar what he's supposedly done wrong. And so essentially he's saying, you know what, I'm bringing in extra counsel. I'm bringing in Agrippa and Bernice so that they can hear this matter and help me figure out what we need to tell Caesar. Well, once Paul is brought in and they began to have this line of questioning that has taken place, and we're not going to have time to get into chapter 26 this morning. We are out of time. But chapter 26 is where we're going to see this interrogation take place. And when we get to the end of this interrogation, we're going to have a statement from Agrippa that we're going to spend some time talking about. You remember the statement, almost, thou persuadest me to be a Christian. There's some speculation about whether Agrippa was really sincere in that statement, or if he was just saying that to appease Paul in some way. I want you to read through this chapter as you have opportunity in the next week. Pay close attention to the behavior that Agrippa portrays. And we'll talk about that when we come together next Sunday morning. We'll start in chapter 26 and verse 1 next Sunday morning.